Jonathan Marks was the CEO of one of the biggest manufacturing companies in the country. He had built the business from the ground up, starting with a small factory and a handful of employees. Over the years, the company grew into a massive operation, with thousands of workers, advanced machinery, and offices in multiple cities. From the outside, Jonathan seemed to have it all: success, wealth, and respect. But deep down, he felt something was missing. In the early days, Jonathan used to walk the factory floor almost every day. He knew his employees by name, asked about their families, and even shared lunch breaks with them. But as the company expanded, his role changed. Meetings, business trips, and investor calls filled his schedule. The days of personal connection with his staff slowly faded away. Most of the time, the only updates he got about the workplace came from reports written by managers. One evening, Jonathan was going through a quarterly performance report when something caught his attention. The report mentioned high turnover. In the janitorial department, it didn't seem important to most executives, but for Jonathan, it raised a question: why were so many cleaning staff leaving? He tried to recall the last time he had spoken to someone from that team, but he couldn't. That realization hit him hard. The janitors were part of the company's foundation, keeping everything clean, safe, and operational. Yet he barely knew anything about them. That night, Jonathan couldn't sleep. He kept thinking about how disconnected he had become from the very people who made his company run. What was happening in the day-to-day life of his employees that he didn't know about? Were they happy? Were they being treated fairly? Truth was, reports and numbers could never tell the whole story. He needed to see it for himself. The next morning, Jonathan arrived early at the office. Instead of diving into his emails, he stared out of his window, thinking about a crazy idea that had been forming in his mind. What if he could experience the workplace from the perspective of someone at the very bottom of the hierarchy? What if he could work alongside his employees without them knowing he was the CEO? That way, they would act naturally, and he could see the reality without the CEO treatment that usually came when he was around. It was a risky idea, almost like something out of a TV show. But the more he thought about it, the more it made sense. If he just asked his managers, they would sugarcoat the truth. If he did a company-wide survey, most employees would give safe, polite answers. But going undercover, that would give him unfiltered reality. Of course, this wasn't going to be easy. Jonathan's face was well known in the company. Many employees had seen him in newsletters, annual meetings, and even motivational videos. He couldn't just walk in wearing a different shirt and expect not to be recognized. He would need a complete transformation, new clothes, a different hairstyle, and maybe even some makeup to change his features. The idea both excited and scared him. What if someone recognized him? What if the managers felt betrayed? What if his employees didn't like what they discovered about him? But at the same time, he knew this could be one of the most important decisions of his career. That evening, he called his trusted friend and former business partner, Daniel, to share his plan. Daniel laughed at first, thinking Jonathan was joking. But when he realized Jonathan was serious, his tone changed. "If you do this, you're going to see things you can't unsee," Daniel warned. "You might discover problems you never imagined. But if you're ready for that, it could change everything." Jonathan was ready. He wanted the truth, no matter how uncomfortable it might be. The very next day, he reached out to a professional disguise artist, someone who had worked on films and theater productions, to help him completely change his appearance. They decided he would take on the role of Joe, a middle-aged janitor looking for part-time work. As he finalized the plan, Jonathan felt a mix of nerves and excitement. He didn't know what he would find, but he knew one thing for certain: he was about to step into a world he had been blind to for years. And once he saw it, there would be no turning back. This was more than just a management experiment. It was about rediscovering the heart of his company, understanding the struggles of his people, and finding out what kind of leader he truly was, not from behind a desk, but from the dirty floors of his own business. Jonathan had made up his mind. There was no turning back now. He had already decided on his undercover role. He would become Joe, an ordinary janitor. But deciding was one thing. Actually becoming Joe was another challenge entirely. On Monday morning, Jonathan drove to a small, quiet building on the edge of town. It wasn't a factory or an office. It was the studio of a professional disguise artist named Claire Hastings. Claire had worked in movies, TV shows, and even helped law enforcement with undercover agents. She was the perfect person to help Jonathan disappear into another identity. When Jonathan walked in, Claire sized him up from head to toe. "So, you're the CEO who wants to scrub floors," she said with a curious smile. "That's the plan," Jonathan replied. "I want to see my company from the bottom up. No one can know it's me." Claire clapped her hands together. "All right. Let's turn a CEO into a janitor." The process started with his hair. Jonathan's usual look was neat and professional, short, styled, and a perfect match for his expensive suits. Claire pulled out a dull brown wig, slightly messy and uneven, and slipped it onto his head. Instantly, his sharp business look softened into something more ordinary. Next came facial changes. Claire added subtle lines and shadows with makeup to make him look older and more tired. She used a special putty to slightly change the shape of his nose, and a pair of thick, cheap-looking glasses to hide his eyes. Jonathan barely recognized the man in the mirror. "Now for the clothes," Claire said, pulling out a faded, navy blue janitor uniform. The fabric was worn thin in some places, and the knees were slightly frayed. She paired it with an old baseball cap and heavy, steel-toed boots when Jonathan put it all on. Something strange happened. He didn't just look different, he felt different. The expensive cologne, the leather shoes, the crisp shirts, those symbols of his status were gone. Instead, he smelled faint detergent and machine oil, felt the weight of the boots on his feet, and noticed how the uniform hung loosely on his body. It was uncomfortable, but that was the point. Claire handed him a simple name tag with Joe printed in black letters. "Here you go," she said, pinning it to his chest. "Joe, the janitor. No one's going to look at you twice." To complete the transformation, Jonathan spent the afternoon learning the basics of cleaning work. Claire had arranged for a retired custodian, Mr. Bill Andrews, to give him lessons. Bill showed him how to push an industrial mop, how to mix cleaning chemicals safely, and even how to unclog a stubborn toilet. Jonathan listened carefully, taking notes like a student. He was determined to play his role perfectly. He made obvious mistakes. Someone might suspect something. By the end of the day, Jonathan stood in front of the mirror one last time. The confident CEO was gone. In his place stood a man who looked like he'd spent his life working late nights and early mornings in the quiet, unnoticed corners of the workplace. As he stared at his reflection, a wave of nervousness hit him. Tomorrow would be his first day at his own company, but not as the boss. He would be invisible to the people who normally greeted him with forced smiles and polite words. Instead, they would see him as just the cleaning guy. He took a deep breath. This was exactly what he wanted, an unfiltered, honest view of his company. He wanted to hear the jokes employees told when they thought management wasn't listening. He wanted to see how they treated the people they believed didn't matter. That night, Jonathan lay in bed in his small apartment downtown. Not his luxurious home, because he wanted the full experience. He set an early alarm. At 5:30 a.m., Joe the janitor would report for duty. And somewhere inside that old uniform, Jonathan the CEO would be watching and listening. Jonathan woke up before his alarm rang. It was 4:57 a.m., and the darkness outside his small apartment window felt heavier than usual. The world was still asleep, but in just over an hour, Joe the janitor would begin his first shift. He sat on the edge of the bed, staring at the folded navy blue uniform lying on the chair. For years, he had worn tailored suits, polished shoes, and silk ties. Now he was about to step into a pair of worn boots and a shirt that smelled faintly of cleaning fluid. It wasn't just clothing, it was a new identity. Jonathan dressed slowly, feeling the weight of the boots on his feet and the rough texture of the uniform against his skin. He adjusted his baseball cap low over his forehead and slipped on the thick, scratched glasses that completed the disguise. When he looked in the mirror, Joe stared back at him, not the powerful CEO, but an ordinary man with tired eyes and calloused hands. By 5:45 a.m., he was standing outside the back entrance of the company's headquarters. It was strange to be there without his driver, without security greeting him, without a swarm of assistants. He was just another early worker, invisible to the world. Inside, the janitorial supervisor, a middle-aged man named Frank, greeted him with a brief nod. Frank didn't smile, didn't ask about his morning. He simply handed Jonathan a mop, a rolling bucket, and a list of tasks. Restrooms first, then the lobby floor. Try to be done before the office crowd shows up at 8. Frank said in a flat voice before walking away. Jonathan wasn't used to orders being so blunt. As a CEO, people usually spoke to him with a certain polished respect. But as Joe, the janitor, he was just another pair of hands. The first restroom was quiet, the faint hum of the air vent the only sound. Jonathan dipped the mop into the bucket and began cleaning just as Bill, the retired custodian, had taught him. The work was simple but surprisingly tiring, scrubbing tiles, wiping mirrors, restocking toilet paper. It wasn't glamorous, but he felt an odd sense of satisfaction seeing the room transform from messy to spotless. Around 6:30, the first few employees started trickling in. Some glanced at him, some ignored him entirely, and one young man even brushed past without so much as a good morning. Jonathan realized something: when you're a janitor, you're part of the scenery. People only notice you if you're in their way. At 7:15, he moved to the lobby, polishing the marble floor. As he pushed the mop back and forth, he overheard two employees chatting near the coffee machine. They didn't know who he was, and their voices were unfiltered. Honestly, management doesn't care. They just want us to hit targets. Remember last month when the air conditioning broke in the warehouse? Took them 2 weeks to fix it. One complained. Yeah, but they spent thousands on that new glass conference room upstairs. The other replied with a bitter laugh. Jonathan's stomach tightened. He knew about the conference room. It was a project he had approved. But he hadn't heard a single word about the warehouse air conditioning issue. That meant somewhere between the workers and his office, the truth had been lost. Or hidden. Later. That morning, Jonathan met Maria. She was a janitor in her late 40s, with kind eyes and a warm smile that felt like sunlight in an otherwise cold morning. She introduced herself without hesitation, asking, "First day?" Jonathan nodded, keeping his cover. "Yeah, just started." Maria laughed. "Don't worry, you'll get used to it. It's not the easiest job, but we make it work." They worked side by side for an hour, and Jonathan noticed how Maria always greeted employees. Some replied, most didn't. She spoke about her kids, about how she worked nights at another job, and how she wished the company would replace the old cleaning equipment that constantly broke down. When Jonathan asked if she had told management, she shrugged. "Told my supervisor. He said he passed it up the chain, but nothing happened. I guess some things aren't important to them." Jonathan stayed quiet, but inside, he was shaken. These were the kind of issues that never reached his desk, yet they affected the daily lives of people who kept the company running. By the time his shift ended, Jonathan was exhausted. His back ached, his hands smelled faintly of bleach, and his arms felt heavier than usual. He had been on his feet for nearly 8 hours. But what weighed on him the most wasn't the physical work hit, was the silence in the Sutan Thai world. People spoke to him constantly. They sought his approval, his signature, his decisions. But as Joe the janitor, he was invisible. He had walked through crowded hallways and into busy rooms, and almost no one had acknowledged him as he left for the day. Jonathan realized something that made his chest tighten. If this was how the janitorial staff felt every single day in scene, unheard, then his company had a much bigger problem than he had ever imagined. The experiment was only beginning. But Jonathan already knew this going undercover might be the most important thing he had ever done as a CEO. The second week of Jonathan's undercover journey had just begun. And already, the thin line between Joe, the janitor, and Jonathan, the CEO, was starting to blur. He was no longer walking into the building with the mindset of a boss playing a role. He was living the life of a janitor. The aches in his back were real now. The smell of cleaning chemicals clung to his clothes. And his hands had developed faint calluses he had never known before. It was during one of those early mornings, as he pushed his mop cart toward the east wing of the building, that Maria waved him over. Her smile was warm, but her eyes carried a heaviness that Jonathan couldn't ignore. "You'll want to watch your step," she said, pointing to a patch of floor with a stubborn coffee stain. "It's been here for 3 days. I've scrubbed it twice, but the cleaner we've got isn't strong enough. Management won't approve new supplies." Jonathan nodded quietly. He knew from his CEO perspective that supply requests went through layers of approval. But hearing it from her made it sound less like a process and more like a wall no one could climb as they worked side by side. Maria began to talk, not in the polite, filtered way employees spoke to management, but in the honest, unpolished voice of someone who had nothing to lose. She told him about her life. She was a single mother of 2 teenagers, working 2 jobs just to keep the lights on. The company's pay wasn't terrible, but without benefits that covered her kids' medical needs. She was constantly juggling bills and skipping meals too. Stretch her budget. Jonathan's mop slowed as he listened. Maria wasn't complaining. She was simply sharing the way people do when they're too tired to sugarcoat reality. She spoke about how the janitorial team often worked with broken vacuum cleaners, mops that fell apart after a month, and chemical supplies so diluted they barely worked. And yet, no matter how many maintenance requests they filed, the equipment never seemed to be replaced. "You know what's funny?" she said, with a faint chuckle. "When the big bosses visit, we suddenly get new paper towels in the bathrooms. The floors get polished with the good stuff, and everything smells like lemon. Then, after they leave, it all goes back to normal." Jonathan felt a knot tighten in his stomach. He had been one of those big bosses she was talking about, walking through sparkling, clean hallways, believing that's what the workplace looked like every day. He never realized it was just for show. Later that day, during their lunch, Maria invited Jonathan to sit with her and 2 other janitors, Paul and Denise. They shared their sandwiches and small talk, but the conversation soon turned serious. Paul, a quiet man with graying hair, spoke about the time he injured his back lifting a heavy trash bin because he didn't have the right protective gear. The injury took months to heal, and he lost a chunk of his paycheck during recovery. Denise told them about the nights she stayed past midnight because she didn't want to leave the building in the messy state she found it. Even though her extra time was never paid, Jonathan kept his head down, asking simple questions, letting them talk. He learned more about his company in that single lunch break than he had in years of board meetings. He discovered that janitors often knew more about the company's heartbeat than anyone else. They saw the employees at their best and worst. They knew which departments had tension, and they could tell when morale was high or dangerously low. That afternoon, as Jonathan emptied the trash in one of the upper floor offices, he overheard 2 managers speaking casually by the window. "Why do we even bother replacing the vacuum? The cleaning crew doesn't need the best stuff, they're just janitors," one of them said with a laugh. Jonathan froze. The words hit him harder than he expected. They weren't just dismissive, they revealed a deep lack of respect for people whose work was essential but invisible. He didn't confront them. He couldn't, not yet. As Joe, his job was to observe. But inside, Jonathan felt something shift. This wasn't just about bad equipment or low pet, it was about dignity. These people were being treated as background characters in a company they helped keep alive every single day. That evening, Jonathan walked to his small apartment with heavy steps. He sat on the edge of his bed, staring at his hands that had pushed a mop, scrubbed floors, and carried bags of trash all day. For the first time, he truly understood that while his role as CEO came with luxury and respect, the janitors worked in the shadows, holding up the same company without anyone applauding them for it. He thought of Maria, of Paul, of Denise. Their struggles were real, their dedication was undeniable, and yet, in the company's grand picture, they were almost invisible. Jonathan knew he couldn't change that overnight, but he also knew he wouldn't leave things the way they were. This undercover mission had started as a way to see the truth. But now, it was becoming something more personal. He wasn't just learning about the hidden struggles, he was feeling them. And the more he saw, the more determined he became to change the story. It was a Thursday evening, and the office was quieter than usual. Most employees had gone home, leaving only a few people finishing up late work. The fluorescent lights hummed softly above as Jonathan, still in his role as Joe, the janitor, pushed his mop bucket down the hallway of the executive floor. The air always felt different up here. The carpets were softer, the furniture shinier, and the smell faintly expensive, like polished wood and cologne. This was the floor where decisions were made, where glass conference rooms and high-backed chairs gave off the aura of power. As Joe, Jonathan wasn't supposed to belong here, but janitors went everywhere. That was one of the quiet privileges of the job, invisibility. He had just finished emptying a trash bin in one of the corner offices when he heard voices from the next room. The door was half open, and two managers were standing inside, chatting casually with coffee mugs in hand. Jonathan recognized their names, Richard and Alan, though they, of course, had no idea who he really was at first. Their conversation was harmless complaints about the upcoming quarterly report, jokes about long meetings. But then, Richard glanced toward the hallway and lowered his voice. "You see the new guy on the cleaning crew? The one with the glasses," he said, smirking. Alan chuckled. "Yeah, moves slow as a turtle. Figures, those janitors are all the same. Replace one, another comes along. They're lucky they even have a job here." Jonathan froze. His hands tightened around the mop handle. Richard sipped his coffee. "Honestly, I don't get why we waste money replacing their equipment. They can clean just fine with what they've got. It's not like they're brain surgeons." Both men laughed, the sound echoing in the otherwise empty office. Jonathan's chest tightened, not from anger alone, but from the realization that this casual dismissal might be what many in management truly thought. It wasn't just about supplies, wages, or schedules. It was about value. In their eyes, janitors weren't skilled workers keeping the company clean and safe, they were replaceable bodies. He stayed still, not wanting to give himself away. His mind, however, was racing. As a CEO, he had always believed his company respected all employees equally. But standing there, hearing this, he realized that respect wasn't in the policies, it was in the daily attitudes of the people running things. And those attitudes were rotten in places he had never looked. When the two managers left the room, Jonathan walked in to finish cleaning. The carpet was spotless, the desk neatly arranged, but the words he had just overheard seemed to hang in the air like an invisible stain as he bent down to pick up a stray paperclip. He thought about Maria, about Paul, about Denise, people who took pride in their work despite how invisible they felt. If they had been standing there, Hearing those words, how would it have made them feel? Probably not surprised. Probably just confirmed what they already knew. The rest of the evening passed slowly. Jonathan moved from room to room, cleaning in. Silence. His hands worked automatically, but his thoughts stayed on that conversation. It was more than just rude. It was a symptom of something deeper. If the people at the top could speak like that, what example did it set for everyone below? Them. By the time Jonathan returned his mop and signed out for the night, he felt something in him harden. This undercover mission wasn't just about observation anymore. It was about accountability. He couldn't just walk away from what he had seen and heard. Walking through the nearly empty parking lot, he looked up at the building's tall glass windows. From the outside, it was beautiful, a symbol of success. But now he knew that inside, in some corners, there was a quiet culture of disregard. A belief that certain people simply didn't matter. Jonathan had built this company, but somewhere along the way, parts of its soul had gone missing. And now, disguised as a man with a mop, he was finally seeing it for what it was. He didn't know exactly how he was going to fix it yet. But he knew one thing. After this was over, the people who thought janitors were replaceable were going to learn just how wrong they were. After that night on the executive floor, Jonathan carried the weight of those cruel words everywhere he went. They echoed in his mind during every shift, like a stain he couldn't scrub away. But just when he started to feel like the entire company was poisoned with arrogance, something happened that reminded him why this undercover mission mattered and why there was still hope. It was a rainy Tuesday morning. The kind of rain that drummed endlessly on the roof and made the parking lot shimmer under dull gray skies. Jonathan, as Joe, was in the loading dock area, mopping up muddy footprints. This part of the building was far from the polished offices upstairs here. Forklifts beeped in the distance, and the air smelled faintly of cardboard and motor oil. That's when he met Chris. Chris worked in logistics. A tall man in his 30s, with strong arms and a voice that carried warmth in every word. He walked into the dock carrying a heavy box, noticed Jonathan struggling to pull a mop bucket over a small step, and without hesitation, set the box down and grabbed the other side. "Here. Let me help you with that," Chris said. Jonathan was taken aback. Most employees, even the friendly ones, tended to pass by the janitors without stopping. "Oh, thanks. Kay can manage," Jonathan replied, trying to stay in character. Chris smiled. "I know you can, but why make it harder than it needs to be?" They shared a laugh, and soon Chris was telling him about his day. He had started work at 5 a.m., sorting shipments and organizing pallets. It was physically demanding work, but he didn't complain, he said. He liked the team down in logistics because they looked out for each other. Later that morning, Jonathan's mop handle suddenly snapped in half. The old wooden stick had been weak for weeks, and now it finally gave way with a sharp crack. Jonathan sighed, knowing the backup mops were even worse. But before he could go fetch one, Chris reappeared. "Whoa, that's no good," Chris said, taking the broken handle from him. "Hang on a minute." He disappeared into the warehouse and returned with a broom handle. "Here won't be perfect, but I can rig this up for you." He knelt down, pulled out a roll of duct tape from his tool belt, and within minutes, Jonathan had a solid, makeshift mop. "There," Chris said, handing it over. "Not pretty, but it'll hold until you get a proper one." Jonathan thanked him, but Chris just shrugged. "We all need a little help sometimes. My mom used to clean houses, so I know how rough it can be when your tools don't work right. People think it's just sweeping and wiping, but it's real work. Respect to you, man." The words hit Jonathan deeper than Chris could have guessed. Respect. That was the very thing so many others seemed unwilling to give. And here was a man who wasn't a manager, wasn't on some corporate diversity committee, but simply recognized the value of another person's work. Over the next few days, Jonathan noticed more acts of kindness, small, quiet moments that didn't make it into any report. One evening, he saw a young marketing assistant named Leah drop her stack of papers in the hallway. Without hesitation, Denise from the janitorial crew hurried over, helped her gather the scattered pages, and even offered to run them upstairs for her since she was heading that way. Another time, Maria came in early not for extra pay, but just so she could restock the coffee station before the early shift workers arrived. "They work hard," she told Jonathan. "A fresh cup of coffee helps start the day right. Costs me nothing to make sure it's ready." Jonathan realized these moments were the company's true backbone, not the big deals, not the fancy conferences, but the people who still cared about others, even when no one was watching. That night, as he walked to his small apartment through streets slick with rain, Jonathan felt something new. The anger from overhearing those disrespectful managers was still there, but now it was joined by a sense of possibility. Yes, there were people who treated others as replaceable, but there were also people like Chris, Maria, and Denise, people who showed that kindness and dignity could still exist, even in a system that sometimes forgot them. Jonathan knew one thing for certain: when this undercover mission ended, those small acts of kindness would be the seeds of something bigger. They were proof that change wasn't just possible, it was already quietly happening. All it needed was someone to notice, nurture it, and let it grow. 2 weeks had passed since Jonathan first stepped into his company as Joe the janitor. In those 14 days, he had learned more about his business and about people than he had in the last 5 years as CEO. He had seen the quiet kindness of workers like Chris and Maria, but also the cold arrogance of managers who dismissed an entire group of employees as replaceable. The experiences had changed him. He could no longer look at his company through spreadsheets and reports alone. He had felt the sore muscles, the heavy boots, the sting of being ignored. He had listened to struggles that never reached the top floors, and now it was time for everyone to hear the truth. Jonathan chose Friday afternoon for the reveal. Most of the staff would be present: office workers, warehouse teams, logistics crews, and, of course, the janitorial staff. The meeting was announced as a special company-wide update in the main assembly hall, the kind of vague title that stirred curiosity. When the employees arrived, the CEO was nowhere to be seen. Instead, Joe the janitor stood near the back of the room, still in his faded uniform, his cap pulled low. People barely noticed him, as usual. Some chatted in small groups, others checked their phones. Then the company's HR director walked up to the microphone. "Before we begin," she said, "we have a special guest who's been with us these past 2 weeks in a very unexpected way." She glanced toward the back. "Joe, could you come up here?" All eyes turned to him. Jonathan's heart pounded as he stepped forward, his boots echoing on the polished floor. He could feel the weight of dozens of curious stares. When he reached the stage, he took a deep breath, removed his cap, and slowly pulled off the thick glasses. There were a few murmurs in the crowd, small gasps as faces started to register the truth. Then, in one smooth motion, he unzipped his uniform jacket, revealing a crisp white shirt underneath. The room fell silent. "Most of you know me as Jonathan Marks," he said, his voice steady but carrying emotion. "CEO of this company. But for the last 2 weeks, I've been Joe, your janitor." A ripple of shock moved through the room. Some employees looked wide-eyed. Others covered their mouths in disbelief. Maria's hands flew to her face. Chris let out a stunned laugh and shook his head. Jonathan continued, "I wanted to see what life is really like here, not from the view of my office, but from the floors. You walk every day. I wanted to know how we treat the people who work behind the scenes, the ones who don't make headlines but keep this company running." His voice tightened slightly. I've seen dedication, kindness, and teamwork that inspired me. But I've also seen things that disappointed me, deeply disrespect, neglect, and a lack of recognition for some of the hardest working people here. He paused, scanning the crowd. I've heard your struggles with broken equipment, unsafe conditions, and the feeling that your work doesn't matter. Let me tell you, this matters. You matter. And that's going to change. Murmurs of agreement swept the room. Maria's eyes glistened with tears. Chris gave him a slow, approving nod. Jonathan took a deep breath. From this day forward, we will be upgrading every piece of cleaning equipment in this building. We will be increasing pay for our janitorial staff, adding health benefits, and making sure every department has the tools it needs to do the job right. And we will be implementing a new training program not for you, but for management, because respect is not optional in this company. The room erupted in applause. It wasn't polite. Clapping it was genuine, raw appreciation. People stood, some whistled, others simply smiled through watery eyes. Jonathan stepped back from the microphone, letting the moment breathe. He knew these changes wouldn't erase years of neglect overnight. But this was the beginning, loud. Public commitment to do better. And as he looked out over the crowd, Jonathan felt something he hadn't felt in a long time. Pride. Not just in his company, but in the people who made it worth leading. The reveal was over. But for Jonathan, the real work was just beginning. A speech, no matter how moving, was worthless without action to back it up. And he was determined that the promises he had made that Friday afternoon would not become another set of good intentions lost in the shuffle of business priorities. The following Monday, the building felt different. There was an energy. In the air, a ripple of cautious hope. Word of Jonathan's undercover mission had spread beyond the walls of the company. Employees had told friends, family, and even local news outlets. For the first time in years, people were talking about the janitorial team with admiration instead of indifference. The first change was immediate. New cleaning equipment arrived in large boxes at the loading dock. Industrial mops, high efficiency vacuums, ergonomic trash carts, and non-toxic cleaning solutions that actually worked. The janitorial staff gathered to open the packages, their faces lighting up as they realized this wasn't just a symbolic gesture. This was real, tangible improvement. Maria ran her hand over the handle of a brand new mop and looked at Jonathan. "You actually did it," she said softly, almost in disbelief. Jonathan smiled. "I said I would, and I'm not done yet." Next came the pay adjustments. Within weeks, every member of the janitorial team saw an increase on their paychecks. The new wages reflected the essential role they played. And for some, it meant finally being able to cut back on second jobs, spend more time with their families, and save for the future. But perhaps the most impactful change was the one that couldn't be measured in dollars. Respect. Jonathan rolled out a mandatory workplace respect and recognition program for all managers and supervisors. It wasn't a boring online module to click through. Was an in-person workshop where employees from every department shared their roles, challenges, and contributions. Managers had to spend a full day shadowing a department they didn't understand. Warehouse managers worked on the loading docks. Office executives spent time in customer service, and yes, some even joined the janitorial crew for a shift. The effect was transformative. People began to see each other differently. The quiet background workers were no longer background. They had names, stories, and skills that others now appreciated. Departments started thanking one another more openly. A simple good morning to the janitorial crew became normal. 4. Jonathan, the changes didn't stop at the company doors. He began speaking at business conferences, sharing his undercover experience as a lesson in leadership. "If you want to know the health of your company," he would say, "don't just ask your executives. Ask the people cleaning your floors." 6 months after the reveal, The company hosted its first ever Employee Appreciation Day, where every team from top executives to night shift cleaners was celebrated equally. Maria received a standing ovation when she was recognized for 15 years of service. Chris from logistics was honored for his consistent teamwork and problem solving. Denise, who used to stay late without extra pay, now had a team to help her finish on time, and she finally felt her efforts were valued. Jonathan watched from the stage, his heart full.
Ow.
This wasn't the same company he had seen when he was just a CEO in a suit. It was stronger, kinder, and more united. As the day ended, Maria approached him, smiling. "You know, Joe," she teased, "you were a pretty good janitor." Jonathan laughed. "I had a great teacher." That night, as he locked his office and stepped into the quiet hallway, Jonathan paused. He looked at the clean floors, the stocked coffee station, the small details that so often went unnoticed. They weren't just signs of maintenance. They were signs of care. His undercover mission had started as an experiment, but it had turned into something much greater. It had reminded him and everyone else that a company is only as strong as the respect it gives to every single person who walks through its doors, and for Jonathan, that was the kind of success worth more than any profit report.